One of our invited speakers today is Dr. Murray Brilliant from the Marshfield Clinic, and he's going to talk to us about issues in genetic testing in Navajo populations. This was a large session at the ACMG meeting in the spring, and if you didn't make that, that you'll learn about some very interesting topics.
Good morning. You might wonder why someone from Wisconsin is going to talk to you this morning about Navajos in Arizona. I used to be at the University of Arizona until recently, and now I direct the Center for Human Genetics at the Marshfield Clinic. Our big concern, or big effort, is in developing, using genetics to aid personalized medicine. And this is a very important issue for me personally, and it is one of the reasons that I think that it's important to help understand the genetics of minority populations, including Native Americans, that I worked with when I was in Arizona, and that I continue to work with. American and Indian populations have unique genetic issues, and like other minority populations, they have some genetic disorders that are more common than others, and some that are almost never seen in that population. They enjoy a special status in terms of human genetic studies, and there are many different issues that I'll touch on today about group and tribal identity and issues of autonomy. There are old historical issues with federal authorities and brand new ones as well that have to do with genetic studies. They have specific beliefs, including origin beliefs, which are very important for their status. In other words, they live on certain reservations, and that this is based on the fact that they say that they originated in these particular lands. So if they didn't originate in these particular lands, why do they get to keep them? That sort of thing. There's an act that Congress passed called the Native American Graves Protection, Restoration Act. And this is when artifacts or bones are found, an attempt must be made to give these back to the particular tribe from which that's most closely associated with it. And they have very strong and very negative and very widespread views on genetics and genetic testing. So, as we all know, genetic disorders are found in every population, and then some populations have higher incidence of specific genetic disorders. Tay-Sachs in Ashkenazi Jews, cystic fibrosis in Northern European populations, sickle cell anemia in Africans and African Americans, for example. And these populations have been very useful historically in identifying the genes that are associated with these disorders. There are frequent genetic disorders found among the Navajo and their larger group, which are the Athabascan peoples. And they include albinism, which is one of the disorders that I've been studying for many years, and a type of immunodeficiency, brainstem dysgenesis, a specific type of neuropathy, poikiderma with neutropenia, and microvillar inclusion disease, among others. There's probably another 6 that we've recently identified that are more common among the Navajo. So we believe that the origin of the Navajo people, like other Native American groups, was in Asia, and they crossed the Bering Straits here and moved into North America. The Navajo are part of this larger group called Athabascan peoples. So they have relatives in Alaska and Canada, and we recognize at least 3 different genetic bottlenecks in this group. One of them is that a small number of people cross the Bering Straits, giving rise to all the Athabascan peoples in North America. The second was that a smaller group of these original peoples migrated south into what's now Arizona, and they arrived here about something between 50 and 100 years before the Spanish arrived in the southwest here. And these people, some of them became farmers and settled permanently, like their Pueblo neighbors, and those people we now call the Navajo. And others continued in a more nomadic lifestyle, and they became the Apache peoples. So the Navajo and Apache are the same people, separated by about 500 years, and separated in terms of lifestyle, but essentially speaking very similar language. The third bottleneck occurred as a result of U.S. government policies, which are very real and prescient among current living Navajos, and that is that the U.S. government had a policy to exterminate the Navajo. Around the late 1800s, early 1900s, most of the Navajo were killed, and the remaining Navajo were marched into New Mexico and kept in a kind of prison compound there. We know that, and subsequently they were released and returned back to Arizona. From many genetic studies and other accounts, we believe that the current population of the Navajo Nation, which is about 250,000 people, that they descend from a breeding population of less than 3,000 people as a result of this genocide. Okay. So these 3 bottlenecks, including that last one, which was rather severe, tend to change the frequencies of some alleles which were initially very rare, and now they get enriched into these small populations, as you all know. So these are very important people to study genetically. However, in 2002, the Navajo Nation Council established a moratorium on genetic research within its jurisdiction, and that moratorium stands till today. And they are very concerned about a number of issues, which we'll get into. So this is also not just about the Navajo Nation, but about many other Native American groups who really, feel the forces of history here. That basically, the white people are only interested in profit, power, and control. So if they want to study us, it must have to do with something like that. And they're very concerned about, sort of the popular press accounts of genetics, where we can clone people and we can manipulate people. We can make flies where people come together in some kind of a monster organism, that sort of thing. So they're very concerned about that. They think it's very dangerous. It's against the natural order of things, this cloning and things like that. They also don't like intellectual property kinds of issues that the dominant culture has, including being able to patent various forms of life and genes. They find that to be against all their beliefs, and they see that as legalized deception and theft. And so they have instituted this moratorium. So some of the other contributing factors to this are something that we used to call the Human Genome Diversity Project, what I'll get into, a lack of immediate medical benefits for them, examples of misuse of samples, which I'll talk about, and how that implicates their origin and identity beliefs. They're concerned about being ripped off, and also about their own privacy, sovereignty, and autonomy. Okay. So the Human Genome Diversity Project was, I think, about 10 years ago. The goal was to sample and archive the world's human genetic diversity. That is, to get a DNA sample from all kinds of different peoples, and to study the origins of and patterns of population genetics. In a similar way, geneticists have been collecting DNA from varieties of corn and rice and wheat and that sort of thing. So it was thought that we should collect DNA from the diversity of the human population, so they can tell us all kinds of things like that. And that these vanishing populations might disappear before we can take advantage of that. So people came to the Navajo and other native groups and said, we would really like to get DNA from you. And they said, that's fine. What's DNA? And they were told, it's the blueprint of life. It's what makes you who you are. And why do you want it from us? Well, because you're very different from other populations. Well, why do you want it now? Well, some of these small populations are disappearing. So they thought that, you want something from us, which is the essence of our life, and you want it now before we become extinct. That was the kind of the message. And so they said no. Okay. Now, there are many examples of Native American groups being studied. Among them are the Pima Indians in Arizona, and also there are groups in Mexico as well. The Pima have one of the highest rates of diabetes in the world. We actually, in Arizona, we saw Pima kids, 8, 10 years old, with adult onset diabetes, type 2 diabetes. So it's not unusual to see that. And if they live long enough, more than half of them will go on to develop diabetes. So this is devastating to this population. And they've been studied for more than 40 years. In particular, there's a group from the NIH that actually is in Arizona that has been studying them. And my colleague Frank Dukaku, who unfortunately can't read, this is a conversation that he recounted. Frank has passed away. He was a Hopi geneticist, and he was very concerned about these issues that I'm talking about. So he talked to some of these people, and he said, well, after 35 years, what can you tell us about the genetics of diabetes? And it's pretty much the same now. We can say, well, there's a cluster here, there's this, if you have this allele, or this SNP, you're at 5% additional risk, that sort of thing. It's on chromosome 1 and chromosome 2. And he said, well, do you have a genetic mechanism? No, we really don't. And then he said, well, after 35 years of studying and millions of dollars and a lot of professional training, people who made careers on this, what have you got to say after all this? And they said, well, 2 things. Watch your diet and get plenty of exercise. So they see this very much like the Tuskegee study, in that here they've been studied for 40 years as the incidence of diabetes keeps going up and up, and nobody's really helped them. For a long time there were no nutritionists. There's no money put into to dietitians, nutritionists, exercise counselors, nothing like that. They just studied them while they got worse and worse. And let me give you one more example. This has to do with the Havasupai, who also live in Arizona. They live in the western part of the Grand Canyon, in one of the most beautiful settings I've ever seen. This is one of 3 or 4 incredible waterfalls on the Havasupai Reservation. And this is the Havasupai Reservation, again inside the Grand Canyon. Now, there are about 600, 700 Havasupai, and at one point, these people consented to be studied for diabetes research, and probably more than half of the living Havasupai had DNA collected from them. And of course, when you have, and these people also have a very high incidence of diabetes, and with a small population in which almost everybody's going to get the disorder, it's very difficult to find any kind of genes out of this. It's just not possible. So these samples sat in the freezer for a while, and then they were used to study schizophrenia and population origin studies. I highly recommend this article that appeared in Phoenix Magazine in November of 2008 that goes into detail about all this. And then subsequently, there's another article that appeared recently in the New York Times, which I'll get to in a moment. But after the, in particular after, so one of the papers that was published on this population suggested that the Havasupai, like all other Native Americans, came from Asia. And a reporter called up the tribal offices and said, well, what do you think, knowing now that you have cousins in Asia, you know, that came from Asia? And they said, how did that get found out? We never, you know, who did this? How, you know, we have no recollection of this. And then somebody remembered that some DNA was taken a long time ago with the idea to study diabetes. And for the Havasupai, their origin story is that they emerged from the Grand Canyon. This is their holy place. And really, if they came from Asia, and my ancestors came from Europe, why did they get to live in the Grand Canyon and I don't? You know, why did they get land there? I mean, they just got there a little earlier. Why can't I have a place in the Grand Canyon? You know, that sort of thing. So this is very, you know, this caused quite a bit of problems with the Havasupai, and you know, they decided to sue the University of Arizona, the Board of Regents, and the people who did the study. So they first had a criminal case which was thrown out, and then just recently a civil case was settled just in April. The university and the Board of Regents spent almost $2 million fighting these lawsuits. They settled they paid $700,000 to 41 of the tribal members, returned the remaining samples, and provided other forms of assistance which were not specified. So in actual fact, I mean, this situation made things worse for studying Native Americans, but I think the settlement gives us some hope that that now they can see that if there is some kind of abuse, that there's a remedy for it. And so I think that the settlement actually has helped in terms of moving this issue forward. So again, there's been a lot of distrust, and also this reward business, that the results aren't accessible. The rewards are to the researchers, not to the subjects, and it's not seen as any kind of a partnership. So I've been working for many years with both the Navajo and the Hopi, and this talk is about our efforts with the Navajo. And I've been talking to a number of people for, I don't know, at least 15 years or so, but since July of 2007, had some progress to report. And basically, talking with their IRB, talking with other tribal officials, and setting up, and I'm going to tell you what works, basically. I told you what didn't work, now I'm going to tell you what works. And so what works is setting up a partnership. So I partnered with colleagues at Diné College, which is the Navajo Institute of Higher Learning. And we decided to have some kind of a genetics forum exchange, a kind of two-way communication. And to hold it at Diné College, which is on the reservation, to provide, a native lunch, local catering, having an opening and closing ceremony consistent with Navajo tradition, local advertising, local and outside speakers and consumers. And we held this in 2009 in Shiprock, New Mexico, on the campus of Diné College. And so Shiprock is right over here. It's actually in New Mexico. The Navajo reservation is about, the area is almost a quarter of the state of Arizona. It's enormous. To get from one part to another could take many hours. We're also going to hold different activities at some of the different sites on the reservation. And one thing you can see here is the Hopi Reservation is entirely surrounded by the Navajo Reservation. Okay, this is one of our posters. And we had more than 100 people come, many community members, representatives of academic institutions, community-based organizations, students from Diné College, the Navajo IRB was there, and people from the Indian Health Service were there as well. We started this, the Navajo themselves have produced a video called Gift of Life in the Navajo language. And this talks about their views on genetics. We had an opening ceremony in Navajo by medicine man Johnson Dennison, who also works for the Indian Health Service. It turns out that when people come to the Indian Health Service, maybe they have an infection, so they see the Western doctor who gives them antibiotics. But they also see Johnson Dennison, who figures out the imbalance that led to this infection. And the compliance issues go way up, and people get better after seeing both. And so this is something that I think is important to take into account the local culture, whether it's in treating people for acute problems or for these kinds of things. We had a local MC. Introductions are very important in the Navajo reservation. It's not really what you do, but sort of who you are, who your parents are, that sort of thing. We had different sessions. What is genetics? We also have a language issue. There are many words that are in English that don't exist in Navajo. Words like cell and DNA and that sort of thing. We had a session on newborn screening because I think this is a very important issue in the sense that current newborn screening is done by biochemical studies. It is genetic, it is a medical test, but when we go to DNA, then that may cause some issues. We talked about genetics and the health of the Navajo people, and genetic research, promise and problems, and the future of genetics and the Navajo. So we had a real conversation. We called it a community conversation, and with between speakers in the audience. But the most important conversation was among the Navajo themselves. Various consumers, parents of children with genetic disorders, who really would like those genetic disorders studied, and IRB officials. So we thought it was rather successful because we also had an evaluation of this. We think that most people came away from it thinking that it was quite valuable. And more importantly, as a result of this, we have now the former head of the Navajo Supreme Court has started a commission to study this moratorium and to try to put into place safeguards should this moratorium be lifted. So I think we've actually had a lot of progress in this. So what really works is patience, partnering with the local people, including local speakers, acknowledging the autonomy of the population, and listening and collaborative planning. And so this has also led to this session at the American College of Medical Genetics in Albuquerque this past spring. And I organized 2 sessions there. One on the genetic disorders that are common among the Navajo, and another, and probably more important, an all-Native American panel to discuss their views on genetics and genetic testing to the providers. So there's a need for all of us, Native Americans and researchers, to know about these issues. I believe very strongly that genetic studies will be helpful to Native Americans, as it will be for anybody else. And I acknowledge, of course, that there are very valid reasons for their hesitancy when it comes to genetic studies. Again, my concern about the future of newborn screening, and that we really need dialogue to come to mutual understanding. So I hope that this has been helpful, and I hope that you can put this in perspective for the Native American populations here in the Southeast, but also for other minority populations. So I thank you very much for your attention, and thanks again.
Questions? While I'm taking the microphone to Hans, is the moratorium more about having blood drawn, or is it about DNA? Why have a moratorium, or just more of the social issues?
Well, that's the moratorium is on all genetic studies. Now, there is one study that they're allowing on severe combined immune deficiency, but it's kind of a legal exception, let's say. So one of the things that happens, of course, in developing the immune system is as part of the joining to make antibodies and such, there's a byproduct of circular DNA. And so one of the tests that's used for this is to take DNA sample from blood, and you look and see if you find these DNA circles. Now, you're isolating DNA, but you're really using the DNA almost as a biochemical assay rather than looking for a specific gene. So, and also, because if you identify these kids that have a SCID, bone marrow transplant early saves their lives. It's a fatal disorder otherwise. So the Navajo have allowed this test to be done. That's the only one that's actually kind of using DNA.
So thanks very much for a great talk. I think it's a really important reminder to us about being sensitive to the belief systems of various humans around the world, and that science doesn't trump that. Along those lines, though, I wonder how you handle the conflict of the Havasu belief system of arising out of their territory and the idea of evolution and DNA sequences following populations. That's still a major conflict, it seems, that one has to overcome.
I think that's true. I mean, I think that in terms of, there are many other populations where there are conflicts with current scientific thought on evolution in particular. So these are touchy issues, but I guess what I do is I talk about a particular Navajo belief, and that is the Navajo have a sacred mountain, and if you approach this sacred mountain from one direction, let's say south, it has a certain name. If you approach it from the other direction, they call it something else differently, because the flora, fauna, and everything are different. Your experience is different. It's the same mountain. So in the West, we would call it, how can you call this mountain two things? But it really is two things. So I kind of stress that story and say, science looks at it this way, you look at it that way. We're looking at the mountain from two different directions. So that's kind of the way I handle it. Thank you very much.